Today is the first video in a series called Gaming Origins, where we aim to take various different topics in gaming, be it a series, game, character, console, etc., and look at their origins. You may be aware of a little game coming out in a few weeks called Horizon Zero Dawn, and today we're going to be looking at the origins and history of its developer, Guerrilla Games. Guerrilla Games is a first-party dev operating in the Netherlands which began in 2000. Owned entirely by Sony as of 2004, with Herman Holst as the managing director, who you've most likely seen in promotional videos for Horizon. Before being bought by Sony, they were known as Lost Boy Games that made some pretty mediocre at best games, such as Tiny Toon Adventures on the Game Boy Color, and became known as Guerrilla Games in the middle of 2003. If you've heard of Guerrilla Games, you will most likely know them for the majority of their work revolving around the Killzone series. Also exists, or should I say existed, is Guerrilla Cambridge, which was closed by Sony as of last month. Guerrilla Cambridge created such games as Medieval, Little Big Planet PSP, Killzone Mercenary on the Vita, and very recently the PSVR game Riggs. Guerrilla Games' first ever game released in 2004 was called Shellshock Nam 67 on the PS2, Xbox and Windows. Set in the Vietnam War, a FPS and the first of many from them, their first game was not particularly well received, scoring only 58% on Metacritic on consoles and even lower for the PC release at 50%. Shellshock would get a sequel many years later, although by an entirely different studio, which was also pretty poorly received, even more so in fact. Their second game landed in the same year, only a couple of months later and the beginning of one of PlayStation's most notable series, Killzone. Killzone released exclusively on the PS2, taking place in the 24th century, detailing a war between humans and the Helghand. Killzone received mixed reviews, giving it a relatively average review score of 70%. A couple of years later, Guerrilla Games released a PSP game, Killzone Liberation, continuing with the story from 1, however this was no FPS. Instead a top-down isometric twin-stick shooter. The game, despite being a change in gameplay, paid off and received a positive score of 77% overall. Up until this point, Guerrilla Games haven't produced particularly any top-tier AAA games. However, in 2009, after years of development, they released Killzone 2, a first for the series arriving on the PS3. Killzone 2 was very sought after before its release, hoping to fix many of the flaws the first game suffered, attempting to make Killzone as one of PlayStation's main series. The game seemed to succeed, scoring an average of 91% on Metacritic. A couple of years later, in 2011, Killzone 3 landed, playing similarly to 2 with a number of changes and tweaks to streamline the gameplay. The addition of jetpacks from Liberation and a revamped combat system were nice additions. 3 didn't get quite the raving reviews 2 did, however still scored a very respectable and good score of 84%. A launch title for the PS4 in 2013 was Killzone Shadowfall, one of the big games that launched to push the system and graphically Guerrilla's best release to date. Shadowfall, although graphically fantastic, fell short on the gameplay side and was ultimately a little bit of a letdown based on fan expectations, although still garnered a decent enough score of 73% on Metacritic. As you can tell, Guerrilla Games up to this point have really only developed FPS and Killzone games. Horizon Zero Dawn is a big departure from what they're used to, being an action RPG and one that looks to be a big payoff. One of the biggest exclusives of the year, and from extensive plays from the media, seems to be shaping up extremely well. We'll know for certain very soon when you can purchase it for yourself in the next few weeks. Will this be the game that finally propels Guerrilla to a juggernaut developer, or do you think it will fall flat?